The morning I turned 16, nobody offered me a place to stay. It was March of 1923, in a mining settlement called Varda, tucked into a narrow valley in the eastern highlands where the mountains ran like broken knuckles against the sky. The air smelled of coal dust and damp limestone. The river below the camp ran brown with tailings. I had been working the sorting shed since I was 12, picking shale from ore, hauling barrows, sweeping dust that never settled. And I had done it without complaint because my mother was dead and my father had gone north 2 winters before and never come back. The foreman, a man named Harkin, told me that morning that they were closing the youth bunks. "Company says we need the space," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Men with families get priority. You understand?" I understood. I was not a man with a family. I was a boy with nothing, and boys with nothing were easy to move along. "Where should I go?" I asked. Harkin shrugged. He had a way of shrugging that meant the conversation was finished whether or not the question had been answered. I stood in the sorting yard with a canvas sack that held everything I owned: a wool blanket, a tin cup, a folding knife my father had left behind, a stub of pencil, and a water-stained notebook I used for sketching the things I saw. Rock formations, weather patterns, the way water moved through cracks in the cliff face above camp. Nobody had asked me to keep that notebook. Nobody knew I had it. One of the older miners, a man called Duff, who had been kind to me in the way some men are kind to dogs, with idle affection and no real obligation, found me sitting on a stack of timber near the east trail. "There's an old watch post carved into the ridge," he said, pointing up toward the jagged crest that loomed above the valley's eastern wall. "Stones cracked, whole slopes unstable. If you're smart, you'll stay away from it." He said it the way people warn you about things they believe are already decided, not to help you, but to clear their conscience. He didn't expect me to go. That was exactly why I did. The ridge stood above the valley like a broken tooth, steep, jagged, always shedding loose rock. The trail up was barely a trail at all, just a series of boot scrapes and handholds worn into the stone by men who had used it years ago, when the mining company still posted a lookout above the eastern approach. The company had abandoned the post when the slope started cracking. Nobody had climbed it since. I went up in the early afternoon when the light was good and the wind had dropped. I carried my sack on my back and a coil of rope I had taken from the discard pile behind the equipment shed. My boots slipped twice on loose gravel. Once I grabbed a thorn bush to keep from sliding and opened a cut across my palm that bled freely for 10 minutes before I could tie it off with a strip of cloth. Halfway up, hidden behind scrub and thorn, I found the entrance. It was not really a cave, more like a shallow chamber cut directly into the mountainside, perhaps 15 feet deep, 10 feet wide, with a ceiling just high enough for a grown man to stand. The stone walls were rough-hewn, still showing the marks of the tools that had carved them. An old iron bracket hung from the ceiling, where a lantern had once been fixed. The floor was covered in loose debris, gravel, dust, dry leaves blown in by decades of wind. From the outside, it looked like the first thing that would collapse. The entrance lip was cracked. Hairline fractures ran across the outer stone like veins on the back of a hand. A section of the ceiling near the mouth sagged slightly, and when the wind pushed hard against the cliff, the whole chamber seemed to groan, a low, unsettling sound that came from somewhere deep inside the rock. I almost turned back. I set down my sack. I stood very still, and I looked. Not at the cracks, at the stone behind the cracks. The fractures on the surface ran through the outer layer, a shell of sedimentary rock that had been exposed to weather, frost, and thermal cycling for decades. It was peeling away in sheets and slabs, the way bark peels from a birch tree. Dramatic to look at, easy to mistake for structural failure. But the inner chamber was different. The walls behind the crumbling shell were dense, dark granite, the mountain's spine. I pressed my hand against the back wall and felt nothing but cold, unyielding stone. No vibration, no give. The floor slanted slightly inward, which meant water would drain toward the back and away from the entrance rather than pooling where it could freeze and split the rock. And along the back wall, I found a row of old anchor holes drilled deep into solid stone by the men who had built the post originally, sunk at least 8 inches into granite that had not shifted in 1,000 years. The chamber was not unstable, it was misunderstood. The part everyone feared, the cracked surface, the groaning ceiling, the loose gravel, was the mountain shedding its dead skin. The part that mattered, the spine, the anchor points, the inward slope, was as solid as anything in the valley. So I stayed. The first week was the hardest. I cleared the loose debris from the entrance by hand, filling my canvas sack again and again and dumping the rubble down the slope. The gravel alone took 2 full days. Beneath it, I found the original floor. Flat stone, hand-leveled, still true after all those years. The outer lip of the entrance was the weak point, a slab of fractured sedimentary rock, roughly 4 feet wide and 18 inches thick, hung over the mouth of the chamber like a cracked shelf. It was too heavy to remove and too unstable to trust. One hard freeze-thaw cycle or one strong tremor would bring it down, and if I was standing beneath it when it fell, that would be the end. I needed to brace it. I spent 3 days hauling timber from the lower slopes, deadfall pine, mostly, dry and hard, and light enough to carry on my shoulder. I cut the logs to length with my folding knife and a borrowed hand axe I had traded a day's labor for at the supply post downriver. I notched the ends and fitted them into the original anchor holes in the back wall, then wedged them tight against the cracked outer slab, creating a lattice of interlocked braces that distributed the weight of the fractured stone across the solid granite behind it. It was not elegant, but it was sound. I carved a secondary support arch from salvaged stone blocks I found scattered on the slope below, remnants of the original construction. I stacked them dry, fitting each block by hand, testing the balance, adjusting until the arch could stand on its own weight. Then I positioned it just inside the entrance, directly beneath the weakest section of ceiling, so that if the outer stone cracked further, the arch would catch the load before it reached the inner chamber. I placed weighted lines along the walls, lengths of rope with small stones tied at intervals, hung from pegs driven into the granite. If the mountain shifted, even slightly, the stones would swing and click against the wall. An early warning system. Crude, but reliable. At night, I lay on my wool blanket on the stone floor and listened. The mountain never goes silent. It clicks, it shifts, it breathes. Tiny contractions in the rock as the temperature drops. The whisper of gravel settling on the slope outside. The faint drip of water seeping through a hairline crack and running down the back wall into a shallow groove I had chiseled to guide it into a tin cup. I learned to read those sounds the way other boys learned to read books. A sharp crack meant surface stone splitting. Harmless, external, the mountain peeling. A low groan meant pressure shifting deeper, and I would check my braces and my weighted lines in the morning. Silence, true sudden silence, meant something had changed, and I would lie very still until the mountain told me what. The first real test came 3 weeks in. A small tremor, barely enough to rattle a cup on a table, rolled through the valley just before dawn. I felt it in my chest before I heard it. The weighted lines swung and clicked. Dust sifted down from the ceiling near the entrance. One of my timber braces shifted a 1/4 inch, and I heard the wood creak under new pressure. I got up and examined every joint, every anchor point, every block in the support arch. The outer slab had cracked further, a new fracture running diagonally across its face, but the braces held it in place. The arch had not moved. I redesigned the outer brace that morning. I replaced the single horizontal beam with a triangulated frame, 3 shorter timbers joined at angles that transferred the load more efficiently into the granite. It took a full day to cut and fit. When I was finished, I tested it by hanging my full weight from the outer slab. It held. Another tremor, a week later, sent pebbles sliding down the slope and taught me where not to build. I had been stacking firewood against the outer wall of the ridge, just below the entrance. The tremor knocked the entire stack loose and sent it tumbling 50 feet down the mountainside. After that, I built my woodpile inside the chamber, against the back wall, where the granite would hold it even if the slope outside gave way. Every adjustment made the chamber stronger. Every failure taught me something I could not have learned any other way. Duff came up once, in April, to see if I was still alive. He stood at the bottom of the trail and shouted up at me. I came to the entrance and waved. "You're mad," he called. "That whole face is going to come down." "The face might," I said. "The chamber won't." He shook his head and went back to camp. I don't think he believed me, but he brought me a sack of dried beans the following week, and he didn't tell Harkin where I was living. Spring passed into summer. I established routines, and the routines kept me sane. Each morning, before the sun cleared the eastern peaks, I checked the weighted lines, inspected the braces, and noted any new cracks or shifts in my notebook. I developed a system, numbered each fracture, sketched its shape, measured its width with a thin strip of copper wire bent to fit the gap, and dated every drawing. Over weeks, the sketches became a record of how the mountain moved through time. Some cracks widened during cold snaps and narrowed in the heat. Others grew slowly and steadily regardless of weather. I learned which ones to worry about and which ones to leave alone. The water seep became my barometer. I measured it with my tin cup, 17 drops per minute in dry weather, nearly a steady trickle after rain, and I logged the count every morning beside my fracture notes. By June, I had enough data to see the pattern. When the seep slowed to fewer than 10 drops per minute, fair weather was coming. When it surged past 30, rain was less than a day away. I could predict storms 12 hours before the sky showed any sign of them. The mountain knew before the clouds did. I trapped rabbits on the lower slopes and fished the river when the water ran clear enough to see the bottom. I gathered wild onion and wood sorrel from the meadow below the ridge and dried them on flat stones in the sun, turning them twice a day so they cured evenly. I learned which mushrooms were safe by watching what the deer ate and avoiding everything else. I made mistakes. A handful of bitter greens that cramped my stomach for 2 days, a root I thought was wild parsnip that turned out to be something far less friendly. And I recorded every mistake in the notebook with the same care I gave to the successes. I traded labor at the supply post for salt, flour, lamp oil, and occasionally a tin of tobacco that I used not for smoking, but for keeping insects out of my food stores. The nicotine in the leaves repelled weevils and ants better than anything else I had tried. I carried everything up the trail on my back, 2 or 3 trips a week, building leg strength and lung capacity. I didn't know I needed until I had them. The miners in the valley watched me come and go. Some laughed. A boy named Kellick, a year older than me and twice as loud, told anyone who would listen that I was living in a death trap and that the next good shake would bury me under 10 feet of rubble. He worked the crushing mill and had never climbed higher than the sorting yard in his life. Most ignored me. A few, like Duff, showed quiet kindness, a word of advice, a handful of nails, a length of good rope left where I could find it. Once, the cook at the supply post gave me a cast iron pan with a cracked handle. I wrapped the handle in wire and leather and used that pan every day for the next 40 years. I didn't need their approval, but I noticed who offered it, and I noticed who didn't. By midsummer, the chamber was comfortable. I had built a raised sleeping platform from timber and flat stones to keep myself off the cold floor. I had carved a fire pit near the entrance with a stone flue that channeled smoke outward and upward, away from the sleeping area. I had hung a canvas curtain across the mouth to cut the wind without blocking airflow. The chamber stayed cool in the heat and held warmth from the fire pit long into the night. The granite acted as a thermal mass, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it even more slowly, so that the temperature inside rarely dropped below 50 degrees, even on the coldest nights. I wrote all of this in my notebook, not because anyone would read it, because writing it down made me understand it better. In August, a girl appeared on the ridge. Her name was Wren. She was 15, small-boned and quick, with dark hair cut short and hands that were calloused from work. She had come to Varda with a survey team. Her father was a geological mapper, and she had wandered away from camp to explore the eastern slope. She found my chamber the same way I had found it, by ignoring what she was told. They said this ridge was dangerous, she said, standing at the entrance and looking at my braces and my weighted lines with an expression I could not read. Parts of it are, I said, but not this part. Not anymore. She came back the next day with a surveyor's compass and a roll of graph paper. She mapped the fracture patterns I had been sketching freehand and showed me how to calculate stress vectors from the angle and depth of the cracks. She explained that the granite spine I had built against was part of an igneous intrusion, molten rock that had pushed up through the sedimentary layers millions of years ago and cooled into a column harder than anything around it. You picked the strongest point on the entire ridge, she said. Did you know that? I knew it felt solid, I said. She smiled. It was the first time someone had looked at what I built and understood it. We worked together for 3 weeks before the survey team moved on. She helped me reinforce the support arch with iron pins salvaged from the old watchpost hardware. She taught me how to read geological maps and how to identify rock types by grain and color. I taught her how to listen to the mountain at night, how to tell a surface crack from a deep shift, how to feel a tremor in the floor before you heard it in the walls. On the day she left, she gave me her surveyor's compass. Keep mapping, she said. You see things other people walk past. I did not know then that I would see her again, but I kept the compass and I kept mapping. Then the real quake hit. September 14th, 1923, just past 4 in the morning. It started with a low vibration, too steady to be wind, too deep to be a rockfall. I was awake instantly. The weighted lines were swinging before I had my boots on. The water seep had surged the day before, nearly triple its usual rate, and I had noted it in my journal with a question mark, not yet understanding what it meant. Now, I understood. Birds burst from the trees below the ridge. Not a few, all of them at once, a dark cloud of wings against the pre-dawn gray. The valley went still in that unnatural way it does before something breaks, every insect quiet, every animal frozen, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The ground jolted sideways, not a tremor, a convulsion. The floor of the chamber lurched beneath me, and I was thrown against the wall. My fire pit scattered coals across the stone. The weighted lines swung wild and tangled. Rock cracked like gunfire outside. I heard it, sharp, explosive reports as entire sections of the ridge face sheared away and thundered into the valley. The sound was enormous, physical, a roar that filled the air and shook the dust from every surface. Below, in the camp, the surface huts collapsed instantly. They had been built on loose soil, compacted tailings and river gravel that liquefied under the shaking, turning solid ground into something closer to water. Timber frames buckled, roofs caved. I could hear men shouting, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of falling rock. Inside the chamber, the outer wall fractured. The cracked slab above the entrance, the one I had braced and rebraced and reinforced over 5 months of careful work, split along its diagonal fault line. Half of it dropped straight down, slamming into my triangulated timber frame with a force that shook the entire chamber. Gravel sprayed inward. Dust filled the air so thick I could not see my own hands. If the support arch failed, the ceiling would drop straight onto me. I pressed myself against the back wall, the mountain's spine, and waited. The shaking grew violent. The floor bucked and rolled. My timber beams screamed under pressure, a high, splintering sound that meant the wood fibers were tearing apart. One brace snapped with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. The broken half swung loose and crashed against the wall beside me. But the arch held. The stone blocks I had stacked and fitted by hand, testing each one for balance, adjusting and readjusting until they locked together under their own weight. They held. The granite spine behind me did not move. The anchor holes, drilled deep into solid stone by men who had built well, even if they had not stayed, did not shift. Because I had not built against the mountain. I had built with it. The shaking lasted 47 seconds. I know because I counted. When you cannot see, and you cannot move, and you do not know if the next second will bury you, counting is the only thing that keeps your mind from breaking. 47 seconds. It felt like 47 years. When the dust began to settle, I crawled toward the entrance. The outer slab was gone, shattered and fallen, along with most of the loose face rock I had spent months clearing. The timber frame was destroyed. 2 of the 3 braces had snapped, and the third was bent at an angle that meant it would never bear weight again. But the inner chamber stood. The arch stood. The back wall had not cracked. The floor had not shifted. Outside, the slope had changed completely. The lower trail was buried under a fan of fallen rock and debris 20 feet deep. The scrub and thorn bushes that had hidden the entrance were gone, ripped away by the rock slide. 2 surface shelters that miners had built on ledges below the ridge, quick, careless structures nailed into loose stone, had vanished entirely, swept into the valley with the rest of the debris. I climbed down carefully, picking my way over fresh rubble that was still warm from friction. The mining camp was in ruins. Half the bunkhouses were collapsed. The sorting shed had buckled. Men were digging through wreckage, calling names, pulling injured workers from under fallen timber. I helped where I could. I carried water. I held a lantern while a man with a broken leg was splinted. I said nothing about the ridge, but they noticed. By afternoon, A group of miners climbed the eastern slope to see the damage. They expected to find the old watchpost crushed, another casualty of the quake, proof that the ridge was exactly as dangerous as everyone had always said. Instead, they found me standing in the entrance of a chamber that was supposed to have fallen. The outer face was destroyed. The slope was scarred. Loose rock lay in heaps on every side, but the chamber behind the ridge still stood. Duff was among them. He looked at the support arch, still intact, and the anchor holes still holding, and the weighted lines still hanging from their pegs along the granite wall. "I told you that whole face was going to come down," he said. "It did," I said. He was quiet for a long time. "How'd you know?" he asked finally. "How'd you know it would hold?" I thought about it, about the months of listening, the sketches in my notebook, the fracture patterns I had mapped and dated, the water seep that warned me, the anchor holes drilled by men I never met, the granite spine that had been there for 1,000,000 years before I was born and would be there for 1,000,000 years after I was gone. "I didn't know," I said. "I watched, and the mountain told me." Nobody laughed. I lived in that chamber for 11 more years before another soul joined me there permanently. But I was never idle. In the weeks after the quake, while the camp below was still digging itself out, I began rebuilding. I salvaged granite blocks from the rubble field the earthquake had scattered across the slope. Good stone, dense and square-edged, broken free from the outer face but sound all the way through. I dry stacked them into a new entrance wall, 2 feet thick. With a proper lintel cut from a single slab, I spent 4 days shaping with a borrowed chisel. The new wall was stronger than the original. The quake had done my demolition work for me. I expanded the interior over the following year, carving a second room into the spine where the grain of the granite ran parallel to the surface, and the stone could be split in clean sheets. It was slow work, 1 inch or 2 a day with a hammer and chisel, clearing the chips each evening, checking the ceiling for stress after each session. By the winter of 1924, I had doubled my living space. The second room stayed a constant 54 degrees year-round, cool enough to store food without spoilage, warm enough to sleep without shivering. I built a proper hearth with a chimney channel that drew smoke up through a natural fissure in the rock, a crack I had mapped months earlier and recognized as a ventilation path rather than a structural weakness. I installed a rainwater catchment system using canvas, funnels stitched from old tent material and clay pipes I fired in a kiln I built from river mud. The pipes fed a stone cistern I carved into the floor of the back chamber, holding enough clean water to last 3 weeks without rain. Kellick, the loud boy from the crushing mill, had been injured in the quake. A falling beam caught his shoulder and broke his collarbone. He healed. He never mentioned my death trap again. Wren came back in 1925 with her father's survey team. She stayed a week, helped me map the geological structure of the entire ridge, and confirmed what I had guessed. The igneous intrusion ran the full length of the eastern crest, a spine of granite harder than anything the quake could throw at it. She left again. She came back again. By 1928, she wasn't leaving. We were married in the spring of 1929, in the chamber, with Duff as witness and a candle burning in the old iron bracket that had hung from the ceiling since before either of us was born. Miners started coming to me for advice. Not about ore, about building. Where to place foundations, how to read the stone, which slopes were stable and which were shedding. I showed them how to test rock with a hammer and listen to the sound it made. A clear ring meant solid stone. A dull thud meant fractures hidden beneath the surface. I showed them how to map cracks over time and predict which walls would hold and which would fail. I kept my notebook. It grew into a shelf of notebooks, 23 volumes over the years, filled with sketches, measurements, weather records, and observations about how the mountain moved and breathed and changed. In 1934, a young engineer from the mining company asked to see them. He spent 3 days reading every page. When he was finished, he told me that my records contained more useful data about slope stability and seismic behavior in the Eastern Highlands than anything in the company's archives. "You should have been a geologist," he said. "I am a geologist," I said. "I just never went to school for it." I died in that chamber. Not young, not afraid. On a winter morning in 1971, with frost on the stone outside and the fire burning low, and Wren sitting beside me, reading aloud from one of our notebooks, the one from the first year, with the sketches of fracture patterns drawn by a 16-year-old boy who didn't know what he was looking at, but looked anyway. Our children were there. Thomas, who became a mining engineer, Clara, who taught school in the valley, David, who inherited my notebooks and carried them to the university, where they are still referenced in papers about Highland seismology. I told them what I had told everyone who asked. Don't build against the mountain. Build with it. Listen before you hammer. Watch before you cut. The stone knows more than you do. Your job is to pay attention. The chamber held. It held through 6 more quakes, 2 landslides, and 72 wet seasons. The arch I built at 16, repaired, reinforced, but never replaced, still stands. They said I was stupid to live inside a cracked mountain. But the part they feared was the part that protected me, and the part they ignored, the quiet spine, the solid stone, the patience of rock that does not move, was the part that held everything together. It always is. The ridge above Varda still stands. The chamber is empty now, but the walls are solid. The anchor holes are still there, drilled deep into granite that has not shifted. If you climb the Eastern Trail, it is easier now the rubble has settled. You can find the entrance behind the new growth of scrub and thorn. Inside, on the back wall, someone carved a line into the stone a long time ago. The letters are rough and shallow, made with a folding knife by a boy who had nowhere else to go. It says, "Look closer." That is all it says. That is all it needed to say. The mountain is still breathing. If you stand very still, you can hear it, the click of settling stone, the whisper of water through a crack, the deep and patient silence of rock that has held for 1,000,000 years and will hold for 1,000,000 more. It is not unstable. It is misunderstood, and it is still waiting for someone to pay attention.